Are you ready to take your first steps towards financial freedom by investing in property? Whether you're a first-time investor or you've started your portfolio but need some help continuing to grow, 2022 REB Buyers Agent of the Year and Rising Star finalist Lachlan Vidler and his team at Atlas Property Group are here to help. As experts in property investment, Lachlan and his team are ready to help you take your next step in growing your portfolio. By completing the research, sourcing and negotiations, Lachlan goes the extra mile to find you a high-performing investment property. Visit atlaspropertygroup.com.au to book in your discovery call absolutely free of charge.
This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Hello everyone, Grace Ormsby here, back with you for a brand new episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. And you may have seen, if you're a regular reader on our site, where we do break some pretty big stories, that there was a story that we did run recently around a buyer actually being able to rescind their contract for sale based on a nasty neighbour. That's how we phrased it. There's a lot to unpack in that story, and I do think it is really, really important that we get someone who has followed this story a bit more closely than we've been able to, and that is the First National CEO, Ray Ellis. Ray, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that we caught you on this pretty last minute, and I know you've been travelling all week, so I really do appreciate it.
That's okay. It's a pleasure to be here, because any information we give to help people sell a property, buy a property, or be an investor and make it a better experience for them, very happy to contribute.
Ray, this is a very, very interesting story, isn't it? So basically what's happened is the West Australian Supreme Court has ruled that a buyer had the right to cancel a property purchase due to the presence of a particularly nasty and belligerent neighbour, leading to around a $500,000 compensation claim being made and the contract eventually being rescinded. And it's still a developing story. I think that's probably worthwhile us mentioning from the outset. And also, I would like to offer up the disclaimer that nothing that we're saying here does constitute any kind of legal advice, but it does just feel like it's a really important warning to be putting out there that this can actually happen. We always say that a sale is done, but in this case, it wasn't.
Well, a contract is a contract is a contract, and once it's signed, it's generally accepted that that is a contract. So this is a precedent that's going to open up a whole level of discussion, not just in Western Australia, but around the whole country, because use the phrase the nasty, belligerent neighbour. I think many people have had experiences of not so nice neighbours or not good neighbours or too nosy neighbours. So if the character and the style and the person of someone living next to you or just in the same street or the same apartment building has now become a precedent for a contract not being completed, is a whole new world for real estate, and particularly investors that are looking to invest in apartments. So I think you wrapped up the case beautifully, because what it is, an apartment was sold, the buyer purchased it. Over the next sort of period of time, at least 6 to 9 months, they renovated, they did things, they lived there, they moved in, they moved out, and it became evident to them that a neighbour in the apartment complex was not the ideal person to be living next to. Now, as I said, we make no commentary about what type of neighbour that person is, but in this case, the buyer felt it was sufficient enough to take action against the vendor and or the agent, that has yet to be determined, that this was information that was not disclosed to them as a buyer. Now, I know in New South Wales, the Act states the agent must provide information that's material or information that could be material, that you would expect it to reasonably know. And the emphasis there is reasonably know. So this judge in Western Australia obviously decided it was information that should have been reasonably known, but the agent, and I don't know the exact agent involved in this case, but if they would have known this information, I'm sure they would have disclosed it if it became evident. So in a lot of cases, the agent is relying on the vendor to provide the information and provide the contractual arrangements to provide that information. In this case, it obviously appears that didn't happen.
It is a tricky one too, because it is mentioned that it is from a strata scheme. And obviously, there are different operating rules when it comes to a strata scheme. as opposed to your regular land where it's Torrens title and
Yep.
you have, complete access to that land. And I think that where this has kind of come about is, they have looked back through the strata reports and seen some potential, whether it's been complaints or issues that have been raised with respect to that neighbour. I mean, it just brings up that aspect of due diligence, doesn't it, really? Considering you should be looking at that.
Exactly. I mean, the average person, when they're buying a new house, buying an apartment, or it's an investor, not so much in the commercial sphere, but certainly the residential sphere, a lot of homework goes into it around the price, the type of property, the outlook, the views, the infrastructure, is it close to transport? So most people do a due diligence in that area. And I think what is missing in this case was the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle of due diligence of doing a strata report, which in most states is around $200. And that strata report will give you access to the minutes of the strata meetings, give you access to what sort of sinking fund had been established, insurance requirements, and it's not for me to pass judgment on the purchaser, but if they'd done that investigation by seeking that strata report, all this would have been revealed to them as opposed to after the event. So I think it's a good point for the investors listening to this program, even just individuals purchasing. Don't just do your research over the facts, do your research over the whole picture. Walk around the neighbourhood, catch the lift a couple of times, see who people, walk around the car park of the apartment, who's parking in the wrong spots, is the rubbish being collected on time, is it a noisy rubbish truck, all those sorts of things. So this is information that affects our quality of life. And I think a lot of pain could be resolved by this if that strata report had been taken care of.
Do you think it does raise concerns around, agents needing to actually ensure that people are taking those steps? Where does the buck stop, really, if you're requiring this due diligence to now be taken into effect to avoid lawsuits happening?
Well, it's a famous phrase, the buck stops here. And the buck primarily stops with the persons that signing the contract, that they've decided based on information they've obtained or they've researched themselves that they're happy to proceed with this contract under whatever state rules those contracts are provided by. I think it's drawing a long bow to expect the agent to know every single detail of plumbing, strata, trees, all those sorts of things in any sales situation, because the local real estate agent is the expert on most things about what's going on in that area, but it's a long bow to say that they must have knowledge of all the neighbourhood and neighbours in an apartment blocks or the person 3 houses down the street. That's up to the individual to walk down the street, see whether the dogs are barking 5 houses down, or just spend some time in the apartment blocks to see what happens on a daily basis there. I think it's an unfair situation to expect the agent to know every single component of what's going on in this block of apartments or the residential area. And if you've done your due diligence, maybe this would have been avoided, as I said. But also, there's no decision in life that you're 100% completely happy with. Whether it's a holiday, a dress, buying an apartment, buying a car, whatever, you make your decision on the best advanced information you have and you run with that decision. It's just this case has highlighted there may be some pitfalls coming further.
I do want to get onto the topic of, how all the parties to a transaction can be better protecting ourselves. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the episode. But before we do that, Ray, I would love to get your perspective here on, is there any concerns from your perspective, having that helicopter view of the industry? Does this worry you that this has come out and it's appeared to go in the buyer's favour in this instance and they have been able to rescind that contract?
I don't want to overreact, but everything becomes a precedent. And, if you've been involved in law and legal cases, I have for many times in my career, judges, lawyers, defendants, plaintiffs, they all make decisions on precedent, what's this around. So this sets a precedent. This judge has determined that the buyer was not aware of this material fact. That, in essence, what it is. And now they're trying to work out some compensation. So there's about $140,000 difference between what the purchase price was and the compensation now. And the information to hand at the moment that I've received, the judge has not been able to make a determination on that because this is a very unique and first off case. But if this becomes a precedent, other ones, it's going to continue to do that or whatever. So it raises the impact of contract law. It raises the impact of commercial law. And I'm not a commercial lawyer to make comment on that, but it does go in the future. But what it has highlighted, which is a point for discussion with some good legal representation, is that since about 2014, a lot of judges around the country have been putting into contracts the principle of good faith. Now, good faith is hard to determine because you're basically forming an opinion of someone's character and forming an opinion of someone's information they provided. So was it an obligation of the vendor to advise that this neighbour's not a nice person as defined by this judge? The contract law would say no, but now they would say yes. Is it an obligation of the agent to provide this information? If they had it, maybe not. If they didn't have it, certainly not, or whatever. So it's a great conundrum now. It's now entering that grey area of what is good faith and what is outside the contract that influences a contract. And the judge in this case in WA has determined that this information outside the contract has now been allowed to influence the contract. That's the worry going forward.
Some really good points to make there, Ray. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment with the Chief Executive Officer of First National Real Estate. Be back on the other side.
Ever wondered how you can invest like the top 1% of Australian property investors? Henderson Advocacy has been at the forefront of helping everyday Aussies improve their financial freedom. So if you're a savvy investor or someone just starting out on their property journey, give Henderson Advocacy a call today. Head to www.henderson.com.au. Don't invest alone. Invest smarter.
Welcome back to this very special episode. We're chatting with the CEO of First National, Ray Ellis. Ray, it's been really, really interesting to get your perspective on this because having read a lot of this as well, share some of the same concerns that you do around how far this actually could go in a legal sense and what it does mean for property transactions of the future. And it does provide a really good warning for anyone who is not only buying, but for sellers as well, to make sure that they're, letting people know, letting the agent know if there are any issues that could be of concern. For real estate agents, anyone working in the real estate industry, it is a pretty big warning on what could be going on, whether or not you're aware of situations like this neighbour that has obviously disgruntled someone enough for them to try and rescind their contract over in WA. And just before the break, talking about good faith, I think that's actually a really, really interesting point that you have brought up because where do we stop with the good faith conversation? What are the kinds of elements that maybe need to be considered and maybe haven't been considered to date, but we should be looking into through a transaction?
On a frivolous nature, if I buy a house with a beautiful tree in the front garden, it looks wonderful in summer. In winter, all the leaves fall down. I've got to rake them up all the time. So is it good faith to say that the leaves will fall off in winter, or is that expected to know? So it really opens up the Pandora's box of what it is. And I think in this case, because it's an apartment, the neighbour may be right next door where you share a wall. The neighbour may be down the corridor where you share a walkway. The neighbour may be on the same floor where you share a lift. So perhaps there's some commonality there of maybe greater information could be provided to support what the judge is saying. But again, is the obligation there on the vendor to comment on other person's lives? I mean, the other side of it is you might say, oh, this neighbour is a horrible person, they're horrible people, and it could be the view of the vendor which is incorrect. So are they doing something? I don't know why they would do that, but if you start to become good faith or opinion, where does that end? Because contracts are very specific. Lot size, land size, dwelling buildings, all that. It's a very concrete structure of what the contract is, and running layers of good faith onto what is a very strict commercial transaction for a building or an apartment size. I'm not the legal expert to say where that's going to go, but it just opens up, as I said before, the Pandora's box, what is relevant and what is not in good faith.
And I mean, for investors who are like anyone really looking to buy, I guess if it is of concern to them, then they should already be making those queries themselves. If your lift can't ding louder than a certain decibel point because it will disrupt your sleep, then you probably should be looking at that before you even consider buying a property, shouldn't you?
Correct. It's a firm advice I would give. If you're buying an apartment as an investor or even as just an individual purchaser, get hold of, in some states, the body corporate minutes, get hold of most states, the strata minutes, what's going or whatever, because that is an investment you're putting into practice. Residential people living there They have a different aspect. But if you're an investor, a sinking fund, cost of insurance, cost of PI, what's going on, these are concerns to you. And if you don't get that strata or body corporate report, you are not doing your own due diligence. And unfortunately, the agent can't help you with that. The legal system, up until this case, couldn't help you with it. May be different in the future, but your fundamental is an investment. And if you're not covering all aspects of your investment, you're not being a good investor.
For sure. And I know obviously, because this occurred in a strata situation, that's kind of where the conversation has lent itself to. But, I'm asked you before if you're worried about this opening up a new set of precedents. Do you think this is something that we should even be worried about when we're talking about Torrens title and the separate enjoyment of one's own land?
I think it's a different case for a house, which is, generally, the neighbour is at least 5, 10, 15, 20 feet away or whatever. So it's a different scenario there because you have gardens and everything like that. But certainly in the strata and body corporate environment, yes, because as I said earlier, it will become a precedent. And the old buyer beware phrase has been strengthened or weakened depending on what your point of view is.
And I guess as well, if we are back talking about land, some of that development opportunity or council rules or bylaws, regulations around dwelling approvals, that's probably something that should also be looked into prior to purchase anyway.
Well, that's a whole different topic of discussion of councils and bylaws, everything like that. There's a case of development I know in Victoria here where there has been 22 separate applications of light and shade of a building moving on to adjoining land and everything like that. And the rules have changed 4 times by 4 different people. So that project is now a year and a half old based on the light and shade drawing requirements of the local council. A year and a half in time for a developer is a long period of time. So that's the rules and regulations, but more importantly, the modus operandi of local councils are getting developments and land and apartments up is the urgent review to solve the housing crisis in Australia.
I mean, because technically you could take this rule for someone to be able to rescind their contract and place it into that kind of scenario as well, couldn't you?
And if it becomes a precedent and the final judgment comes down as what we expect it to be, every lawyer, if someone wants to get out of a contract, will be using this article as the basis for it. And then it becomes the argument, did the agent know, did not know, did the vendor say or not know? Was there relevance not to disclose it? Was there advantage in not disclosing or whatever, based on the perception of what is a bad neighbour? Bad neighbours come in all shapes and forms. A bad neighbour may be someone who drops off extra food around your house every night. You're sick of it. They're trying to do it in good intentions, but I deter from the product.
It is a very curious case, and it's something that we will be watching closely for these developments in the law and with what goes on and exactly what happens with this outcome of this case. But Ray, before we do move on, I'd love to we've heard a little bit about, when you're buying, what you should then be doing for your due diligence. But I'd love to also hear, from the aspect of what a sales agent should be doing to protect themselves from this sort of falling back on them, and then even from the vendor's perspective as well, because it's 2 sides of the same coin, really, but it's something we've got to be thinking about.
All agents around Australia comply with the provisions of the Real Estate Act of the contract of sale, and they're completed with great diligence and great authority. And I can say with great confidence that the vast majority of agents do that to the letter of the law, what's needed. Perhaps now we need a separate file of discussion points, a separate file of interesting points, a separate file of this is the summary of my out discussions with the vendor, what they were doing. Perhaps as a safety point of view, agents, which I know a lot of agents do this already because I like to give information to help them build the relationship with the vendor or whatever. Maybe that form of documentation there has to be a bit more structured and formalised. That when a legal case of this such comes out, you can point back to, here's the notes of my meeting on the such and such a date of a month. Here's a note of my follow-up conversations or whatever. So the agent could become more diligent in that, just to give information to disclose that they weren't aware of the information, that they weren't told it. So it doesn't become a case of he said, she said, but a case of this was our discussions. Here's my notes. Here's my recollection. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that is a great idea. And I think from the vendor side of things, obviously, no one wants to get in the way of getting themselves the best chance of success when it comes to a property purchase and getting that property off their hands. But you probably should be saying something if you've had issues, which are the reasons for you on selling the property in the first place. I think is the bottom line there.
There's a reason you're selling. You're moving, you're sick of the noisy neighbour, the street's too loud for you, your kids have moved on. Everybody has a reason for selling. And I don't think they would let what they consider minor issues get in the way of the selling that house, that it's too hot in the summer, it's too cold in the winter, the neighbour down the street is too noisy or the traffic's too noisy. I don't think vendors are going to be in a rush to disclose that information as long as the property meets all the requirements of the law and the Act and requirements, everything. I think they will stick to doing that. 99.9% of vendors are good Australian citizens. I don't think they're withholding information. But to come back to what started this case, was it information in good faith or not, or relevant or whatever? A judge has decided it was.
And I guess I will just clarify again, obviously, none of what we have been saying today constitutes any form of legal advice. It is still an ongoing development in the law, potentially. We'll have to see what the outcome of this is. It's just thinking points, making sure that we're sort of aware and on top of these potential developments in how property transactions could be going about in the future. So,
correct.
Ray, it's been really great to chat to you on that. We're going to take another break there. We'll be back in just a moment to hear some of your insight into what's going on in the property market at the moment. See you on the other side.
It's time to get help. Interest rates are increasing. Inflation has hit an extraordinary 5.1%, and the chance to secure a golden egg property is getting narrower by the day. Dragan from Buyers Agency Australia has been presenting the facts and helping property investors make smarter, well-informed, educated decisions in property for years. So, what are you waiting for? Get in touch with Dragan today at www.buyersagencyaustralia.com.au. Invest with integrity.
Welcome back to this very special episode. We're chatting with the CEO of First National, Ray Ellis. Ray, it's been great to get your insight onto the potential ramifications of having a nasty neighbour what it all boils down to, really. But let's move on to some more positive things at the moment. Australia's property market has obviously gone through a few changes in the last couple of months. We're operating in quite a different market to what we were right at the beginning of this year and through the absolute boom times that were 2021. From your perspective, how is the market actually trucking along at the moment?
It's a great question. It's a great question, man. Every barbecue in Australia most Sundays. How's the market? And this is my analysis of our offices throughout Australia, New Zealand, the South Pacific. What was confirmed during COVID times is Australians have great value and see great value in the property investments, not just for their investment, but for their home. And to quote that great Australian movie, everybody's home was their castle. And during the height of COVID times, every bank thought there was going to be a large increase in defaults, a large increase in people getting behind in their mortgage repayments. And us as an industry thought there was going to be a high increase in people getting behind their rental payments. What was proven to be true was the exact opposite, that people were not going to allow their home to be jeopardized in any way, whether it be a rental mortgage or own outright property. And so the deferrals of mortgages were at a ridiculously low level. So that reinforced the DNA of what people's values in their home. What we're seeing now is predominantly the psychological shock of interest rates going up, because there's over 1 million households in Australia that had never seen an interest rate rise during their length of their mortgage. So if you bought a house when you're 21, you were 33 before you saw interest rates going up. So your mortgage was a flat rate. That became the norm. That became the standard. What we're now seeing is those mortgage repayments are going up. We're not seeing a large increase in defaults. We're seeing a slowness of activity as investors just seeing what's going on. The federal election stalled that for a while, interest rates going up, because we're an industry of confidence. So people have confidence in their home, people have confidence in property as an investment, and that continues. What we've seen a fall off is the frantic activity of the last 2 years, where people were desperate to get in property as a refuge for whatever reason. They moved out of their city, they changed jobs, they couldn't go on holidays, they needed a bigger house for a home office. All that created activity. But the major impact has been in the psychology of the Australian way we manage our budgets. But we're seeing no evidence, as we did during COVID times, of interest rates that make people consider not having a home. Now, of course, there's some commentary around that in Sydney or Melbourne, the median house prices have come down 3 or 4%. But as I said in a number of occasions the past month is, if there's been 600,000 people buy houses in the past 12 months, 35 want to sell their homes now because it is their home. They don't see it as a share portfolio. They don't see it as an asset they can dispose of quickly. So if you were to go to someone that bought a house 6 months ago and it's now worth 3% less, without exception, they go, oh, that's interesting. It's still my home. I'm still doing the garden. The kids are still happy with their new bedrooms or whatever. And unfortunately, a lot of media commentaries around the value of the house. It's not a house, it's a home. And over a period of time, those prices will stabilise. They may go down a little bit more. They may go up depending on the varies of the market or whatever. But the Australian passion for property has meant there's still strong demand out there because listings, stock availability is still at a record low. The main impact on our market is social housing. And I implore all state governments to return to building good social housing because you cannot rely on the private sector to provide that. And rental vacancies around the country and any network similar to ours are at an all-time low. And I've just come from a tour of Northern Rivers in New South Wales. The vacancy rates there are 0. And they've got 20 to 30 good applicants a week looking for rental properties, job opportunities, but unemployment's very low. So the market is still strong, to answer your question directly. There's still great enthusiasm for owning the Australian dream in a home. There's still great enthusiasm for using property to make wealth investments. It's just interest rate rises have created a psychological shock, but the average Australian is coping with that. They're tightening their budget, and they've done that through COVID times. And also people are ahead a lot in their mortgage repayments. The banks are doing the right things. But if we don't get inflation under control, we'll have a whole separate issue for asset base in our economy. So I support the Reserve Bank in what they're doing. We must get inflation back under control. So the housing market's a bit of flux, but the desire to own a home, the desire to invest in a home is still there. Interest rates will come and go, and the Australian people are ready for it.
Ray, we appreciate that so much. I think it's just a really good way to be sort of contextualizing the property market and what's going on at the moment. It is normal. It's a normal market cycle. It's just come at a pretty awkward time, I guess, hasn't it? Post-COVID, a lot of things have been going on at the moment, but
desperate to be normal again.
Yeah, It would be nice, wouldn't it? But thank you so much for your time today. It's been so great to chat, and I really hope that everyone listening gets some really good insight about what's going on at the moment. And we'll be watching this space very closely. Ray, we'll be having some more conversations, I think, in the future about that nasty neighbour situation.
And may everyone have nice neighbours and nice property. Thank you for your time today.
To everyone who is listening along at home, we hope you have enjoyed this episode. Please like or review us on whatever platform that you do listen to your podcasts on. Stay up to date with us on our social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on our website. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to reach out, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. But that is all we have time for today. Until next episode, stay safe and well. Bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
It's safe to say the property market has been red hot over the last few years, with some of the markets we've selected in 2021 rising over 40% in a 12-month period. It's very likely that if you're a property owner, your property has gone up 20% minimum in value in the past 12 months, and you have most likely accrued sizable equity that can be recycled and extracted to build your investment portfolio. With interest rates increasing, you might be wondering where to invest to maximise capital growth and cash flow in 2022 and beyond. Well, to save you time, energy and guesswork, award-winning author and regular guest on the Smart Property Investment podcast, Paul Glossop and his team at Pure Property Investment have outlined the top 30 affordable suburbs poised for strong capital growth over the next few years with sound cash flow. Grab your free Top 30 Guide to Property Investment guide today at purepropertyinvestment.com.